Give them a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, to the TechCrunch stage. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. With me today is Raj and Steve, two people who have been in and out of the private sector and the public sector working for the government. They both have a very long track record that I'd like them to explain themselves. Just as a reminder, the Slido app is the way to get questions to me in here. So first of all, we know that the internet was basically, funded and supported by the U.S. government in its early days, but, at this point, that feels like ancient history. But now, the U.S. government is back and working in Silicon Valley in a big way, maybe never left, right? And but it's not well understood. So, the Aerospace Corporation, most of all, Steve, is maybe one of the least known entities within the wider matrix, considering its role. So can you just explain what the Aerospace Corporation does and your role in it?
Yeah, sure. We're a nonprofit that we have sort of a special status with the U.S. government. We're 4,000 people, 3/4 in science and engineering degrees, and our role is actually to work with the government on the hardest problems as it relates to space. Anything from civil space like NASA, national security, the regulatory agencies, and a number of commercial startups. So our role is to really go after those hard problems. The government has learned over the years that space is a pretty tough environment. You can do a million things right and one thing wrong and your rocket blows up. And sometimes you can't afford to have those kinds of failures. So they often will go to the Aerospace Corporation. We'll be a partner with them and a partner with industry because by our charter, we don't compete with industry. We don't produce production lines. We're a nonprofit. So we have a lot of NDAs throughout industry that allows us to work very closely and share trade secrets that's critical for their success in working with the government.
And you previously, among other things, were at Virgin Galactic. Can you what was the transition like? What was your view coming into the Aerospace Corp from the private sector in that respect?
Yeah, so early in my career, I'd been in the government, always very interested in going to work with a startup, and I had a good opportunity on the Richard Branson to go do that. Very excited because I felt that space is going through a huge transformation, one that was very government-dominated until the last decade, where we're seeing a lot of the innovation, the new excitement, the new direction coming from commercial industry. So for me, it was real exciting to go out there to create a company from the beginning and to be able to go after the commercial markets that are out there. So what brought me to aerospace is I would argue that this is the first time in our history that we are seeing the kind of huge changes, transformative changes in all aspects of space. Whether it's on the national security side, where they're looking at huge constellations of small satellites, whether it's on NASA, where they're trying to get back to the moon and they're trying to actually partner with industry to get things done, or whether it's just a general government interest to work with the commercial industry. And so aerospace sort of sits at that intersection of all those companies. And so I thought, in terms of having real impact on shaping the future of America's space program and the opportunities out there, there'd be no better place than aerospace.
Perfect. We're going to dig into that more in a second, but first, let's hear more about your background, Raj. I mean, you've been a fighter pilot, you've worked seeding companies, funding companies, supporting companies with government contracts as part of the Department of Defense, and now you're back in the private sector. So you guys have switched places in some ways.
No, thanks, Eric. I've lived or suffered, as you could say, all three sides of the problem, right? So I was an operator, an F-16 pilot who, in theater, in combat, had more capability in my iPad for certain types of navigation than I did in the airplane. Right? Very frustrating. Then I was I've run 2 venture-backed startups, and the first one we tried to sell the government. It was just so painful that we eventually gave up. And then, finally, in the third role, I joined the government and helped set up this thing called the Defense Innovation Unit, whose mission was and is to work with younger stage startups here. So I've seen all sides of the three, and I think there can be. It's challenging for a young company to work with the Department of Defense and the government, but if you can figure it out, the benefits are tremendous, both for your business, for the mission and what your engineers can work on. And the good news is, I think, as you alluded to, over the last few years, you've seen a real sea change of interest from the government to try to understand what happens out here in the Valley and adopt those processes.
Gotcha. And so let's get into this a little bit more. Why has space have so much potential right now on the commercial side? We've talked earlier a little bit about some of the trends in space commercialization, and it's been a rocky road, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So what's happening now on the sort of technology side that's making the government, for example, more interested in startups? And you can get that too.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
One is just the sheer demand that's out there. You know, the government had always thought that it could develop the capability it needs to get the jobs done. But increasingly...
What are the jobs?
Well, whether it's in the national security area, whether it's communications, whether it's GPS, in the case of NASA, they had the Apollo program. They got all the money they needed to go and do it within their own labs and working with some contractors to build their designs to get to the moon. And now we're seeing that all, shift. Now we're seeing the kind of technologies that are being introduced at a much more rapid pace and much more willing to take the risk to introduce those innovations than the government has been able to produce out of the labs. Plus, we're seeing I think we've hit a tipping point in the last 5-10 years where the cost of access to space has dropped dramatically. SpaceX really kind of shook up and disrupted the whole launch market, and now you have all sorts of new companies that are trying to get in at much lower cost, so access to space has gone down. The cost to actually build satellites, it used to be $50, $100, $1 billion a satellite. You could build a satellite today for less than $1 million. We have high schools that are putting in little CubeSat satellites.
Is that through the Aerospace Corp? Or?
Well, even on their own. I mean, we'll work with some, but it's gotten the accessibility of space. So now the cost of entry, you don't have to raise $300 million to get into space. You could start off with a small amount at the amount that seed funding and VC funding allows you to actually get started. So with that, we're seeing a lot more players than we've ever seen before, a lot more innovation taking place. And there's just changes on the government side. Both, whether it's national security or NASA, everybody wants to move faster. Everybody wants to get access to the latest capabilities much more quickly. And they see making use of the private sector and through the entrepreneurship and innovation taking place as the best route.
And let's hear your perspective, Raj, just what you have experienced from both sides working with DoD.
Yeah, very, very similar to what Steve said, right? So if you look at the way R&D and science and technology was done in this country, right? If you were a top graduate in engineering in the 1960s and you didn't work on quantum or cryptography or nuclear, you went and joined the government. They had the best resources, the best computing power, the best people. That's no longer the case, right? The best talent and best engineers are going to younger startups, starting their own companies. In fact, the amount of funding, right, the US government used to be the largest funder of R&D in this country. Now it's like 5x here in the private sector, like those lines crossed in 1984, never to return. And so I think the Department of Defense, just like a lot of large enterprises and old stodgy industries are realizing that this new boom in technology, right, they're not going to get it from the way they used to do business. They're not going to do it in-house, right? So my current business, for example, is in insurance, not related to the government, but again, very long-stayed industry, now coming out here to the Valley to find new technology. And so the government says, boy, technology is converging. So we think about autonomy, robots, AI, the impact that's going to have on individual soldiers and sailors and Marines out in the battlefield is really, really critical. And so what hasn't converged, though, is the processes, right? So the way that these older institutions acquire, operationalize, right, buy and use this tech is hard. And so that's what you're starting to see a lot of reform in recognition. If we don't get access to this, we won't be competitive.
And so what is changing about the process of working with the government for startups? Like what so you, I think, and you gave out like 200 million or so to 65 startups as part of the DoD. Your budget is in the billions, I believe. And you work with all sorts of people. What are you and the people you know and what you see, like what's happening that startups need to know about how they can access this sort of money? whether it's contracts or
Yeah.
funding.
So I think the government's becoming much more self-aware how difficult they are to work with.
Really?
Yeah, and
I don't,
so
I don't know if that's the perception yet. I mean,
yeah, but at a senior level they are. I mean, they're hearing it all the time that there is no way to on-ramp. I've got a tremendous idea that you want it, and I have no way to contract with you because the government has layers and layers of these sort of contracting rules that have to take place, that everything needs to be competed, it needs to be subject to auditable in terms of the books and so on. There's all sorts of terms and conditions that are involved. And it's just things that have accrued over time. So, if you're a startup, when I was at Virgin, I looked at some of those. I remember the government approaching me about going after, competing for some of their work. I didn't want to do it. I was like, no, I got deadlines to meet. I don't have time to spend months on a proposal, negotiating it. Then maybe the money will come, maybe it won't. So I think the government's realized that they've got to make a better effort. And Raj could probably talk about his efforts at DIU. But whether it's things like DIU, the Air Force has also tried to do new things. Recently, they had an event in New York City. They called it Pitch Day, where they had these small companies come in, and it was sort of a kind of a Shark Tank kind of a thing, where people would pitch for 10 or 15 minutes. And then the Air Force was using its credit card, which they're allowed to charge things up to like 100K. And if they like what they saw, they literally would go backstage, swipe a card, and these companies would get 100K in their bank account to get things going. They're actually
contracts, they had to sign.
The actual work for something that the government could get in return. The Air Force is actually looking to do the same thing. They're calling it Space Pitch Day here in San Francisco, November 5th and 6th, where the same kind of thing. They're going to have a number of companies come to stage and pitch their idea. So they're trying to find sort of mechanisms like this to make it the impedance to work for the government much simpler. It's good for initial funding to sort of get you going and to establish those relationships.
Yeah, look, so having worked with a lot of startups, both as a startup and as the government, look, the positives of working for the government, right? You gotta think about why do we want to do this? It's a massive budget. So the Pentagon's annual acquisition budget, it's about 175 billion, right? Of which the R&D piece of it is like 70 billion. So there's certainly a lot of opportunity. Working with the government, you'll get access to data, get access to test ranges for hardware that you won't get anywhere else. Your technology will get put through the paces, so it'll mature very fast, and now is a great signal to venture investors. Right? The downside is it's a massive bureaucracy, and you can get lost. Right? You can think you're talking to someone that's senior and is a decision maker, but they're really not. Right? And so being able to suss that out is critical. So my always recommendation is, find a good Sherpa. Find someone that can help you navigate through that process so you don't waste your time, and work with organizations that have a demonstrated track record of getting things done, right? So I no longer work.
So it basically is the same as doing BD with an enterprise SaaS?
Exactly. Think about doing BD with the largest, most bureaucratic enterprise SaaS company in the world, right? That has 3 million people and, 100,000 different offices. So massive, massive bureaucracy. But if you can navigate it well, the rewards are great. The good news is now there are a few organizations who have been purposely built to help startups navigate. So the Air Forces has a couple initiatives. This Defense Innovation Unit, which is based down in Mountain View. I think that they have done about $450 million worth of contracts with companies here in the Valley across 130 or so companies. So they're a demonstrated track record. So finding places that you can get the most bang for your buck for your time is critical, just like any other enterprise sale process.
So with that, I'm going to start getting into the questions from the audience more. Don't forget, you can get me right here. This is from Nick Harvey, BayAreaRedwood.com. In my experience, finding grants is harder than applying for them. I've been awarded a grant from the county, but only learned about it a week before due date. So I think this is a very general question. Is what are the tactics you recommend for finding the money and finding your Sherpa, as you said? Can you just say websites or organizations that you recommend for this? Let's say someone out here is just ready to type in a URL.
Yeah. I mean, the places I would go to, again, is the one that Raj had represented, DIU. Others are like DARPA, which they were created exactly for this purpose decades ago to make it easy. And so they've had the kinds of things where you could submit unsolicited proposals. They don't want big proposals. They, I think, are actually looking for white papers. They try to find a project manager who's interested, and if he is, I think they have the authority to award up to $1 million, for things like that. The Air Force has created something called the Space Enterprise Consortium, SPEC for short, where it's frankly a coalition of companies that make it also in the same way the DIE is doing it, a very easy way to go out and write some checks to get out there. If I were at a startup, I would probably start at these kinds of organizations. If you get that sort of initial funding, then I would start going with the Sherpas and so on to start climbing the steeper mountains to make it up there. And also, occasionally just visiting, in Washington. When people get pretty excited, if you have the right champion in the right place, then some of the bigger opportunities can flow. But I wouldn't start there.
What are some examples of companies you're familiar with, if you can say them, or maybe you have to anonymize their names, who have done this sort of thing, right? Maybe they are a small startup and they just put all the pieces together correctly. Like, who are some example companies, if you can just describe what they did?
I mean, there's a well-known one that I remember when it was a little company with a little rocket and they couldn't get any government contracts. It was called SpaceX.
Okay.
And they did it the hard way. And I remember early on, I had a chance to speak with Elon Musk, and he said, how do I break into the government? I said, look, the government is just not going to write you a check, but if you can show that you, A, have a product that works, and then B, you're really willing to get into it with the government in terms of pushing for that product, you can do it. So, he had his so-called Falcon 1, which is his little rocket. It blew up the first 3 times. The 4th time was a charm. And then he decided, okay, now that I've mastered rocketry, I'm taking on the big guys. So he built the Falcon 9, which is the big rocket that now, frankly, can fly almost any of the government satellites. So the next step for him is he had a hard time sort of initially breaking in, and so they had to throw some elbows, had to hire a number of Sherpas to actually get in there, and the government has changed. So now, because of the work that SpaceX has done, you've got other companies, Jeff Bezos, the CEO from Blue Origin was speaking early this morning. They're able to come in. So we are seeing now a lot more sort of so-called new entrants, companies that are investing their own money that are now able to make it through the door. And then SpaceX has done well, whether it's Air Force launches or they've done a number of NASA launches as well. In fact, they're going to the space station with their own capsule.
Right. So how easy is it for a non-US citizen founder to get funded by the government? This is from Vivek Gopal Ramaswamy.
It's hard. Again, it depends sort of what the product is, but the government can often be protective in terms of that being a U.S. company, or particularly if it's sensitive activities like for building a rocket, munitions issues, get involved. There are companies that do it. I mean, Virgin was not started as a U.S. company, but they established a U.S. presence. There's another company called Rocket Lab. It was actually, they developed their own rocket in New Zealand and have established a U.S. presence. So there are ways that if you sort of are big enough and you want to get sizable contracts with the government, that you can establish a U.S. presence.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer both of your questions. So one, you asked, hey, what are websites people can go to and what are examples? And I'll answer the second one. So there's 2 websites. You can go to diu.mil or you can go to iqt.org. Both of those are entities here in the Valley that have been funding companies. And if you go to their site, you'll see a listing of their portfolio companies, many of which were 4 or 5 engineers with a great idea, met with these groups, got some initial slugs of financing or contracts, and then have now grown into really large names that are familiar to everyone here, and several that have gone public or in unicorn status. So it certainly can be done. I think to the question around non-U.S. citizens, some things are changing. Now, if you're trying to do something really secretive, may be difficult, but there is a change where there's, for some of these organizations, and DIU in particular, they can look at, how sensitive is this technology? Is it still better for the government to get access to it? Because we know that, 50% of startups here in the Valley are founded by immigrants, and so we need to be able to get access to that. And so you're seeing changes in that. You're seeing a broader acceptance of it. Not that it's always that easy, but things are evolving.
And so just to get back into the details of like getting through the process, we have a question from Ehab. Is the source for a startup only capital, or is there technical and operational support too?
Yeah, I think Raj actually had alluded
Yeah.
to that, but there's these things called OTAs, which are these so-called other transactional agreements, but it's ways that government agencies not only have to necessarily have an exchange, have funding, but they actually can make some of their facilities available. The government is, like at Aerospace Corporation and other government, they have laboratories with unique tools, unique testing ranges, and so on, that you can get access to test your rocket engines, for example. And they have agreements that some cases, no exchange of funds. Maybe even if you share some of your data, you'll have some exchange. So the government does try to provide that kind of technical expertise. I know when I was in the private sector, we often made use of it when I was working, doing some work with NASA, and they encourage that kind of exchange.
Yeah, I mean, I know of 3 UAV companies that worked with the government, not because of the contract they got, but they got access to restricted airspace that was outside of FAA control, so they could actually test their birds, and if it crashed, it was okay. Otherwise, how do you test your new UAV if it's going to transport cargo or people? Right, it's very difficult. And so there's lots of things like that. If you think about the amounts of data that some of these organizations have, they can be shared, imagery data. So there's lots of things like that that you can use to increase or accelerate your own product development.
Are there new funding vehicles with higher award rates than DoD, SBIRs, or BAAs? This is from Jonathan W.
Yeah, sorry, can you say it again?
Are there new funding vehicles with higher award rates than DoD, SBIRs, or BAAs? Very specific question.
Very, very specific. Well, there's a new contracting vehicle thing, as you call it, it's called Other Transaction Authority. Basically, it's the government's attempt to contract with companies and make it look like a commercial contract. And so a lot of the issues that you normally would face, like, hey, I have to have a second accounting system, or I have to give you all my IP, or anything else that would just be a basic non-starter, they're able to cut through. But more importantly, there's lots of programs to get R&D, like grants and funding, and those are great and they're helpful, but you really want the true prize, which is you want to go into production. Like, you want to sell at scale. That's why you're working there. And these OTA vehicles, without getting too into the arcana, allows a smooth transition or smoother transition to those production levels.
And so this is from Parker. How does an early stage startup with a new product approach the government? What are the first steps? What's the very first step? Go to spec. Go to the Air Force demo days. Like, what's the first thing you do?
I mean, to me, it's like any other sales process. It's a human connection. There's a human element, right? So if you were able to raise money, if you're able to hire engineers, somehow you must have an ability to network. So find your way to talk to the right folks.
Besides you guys here right now, what are good sort of events or things where you can meet people who are going to be the right sort of people for this?
Yeah, I was going to have sort of a similar answer. There are conferences, dedicated. In fact, there's one I know we're working with you all in LA next summer, dedicated to the space industry. Space Symposium in Colorado Springs. There's usually a big satellite conference in DC or in Paris. There's a small satellite conference that also takes place. So there's a few big events that actually just going there, people are very approachable at these conferences, is a good way to sort of get some of the early vetting on some of your products. And frankly, it's kind of efficient, because one of the things that's a pain in the butt with the government is sometimes you find yourself having to fly around to see different people. So sometimes by going to these well-established conferences, you can get a tremendous amount of effort done and a lot of pre-screening on your products.
And so here, this is again from Nick Harvey. In my experience, SBA loans, line of credit are woefully inadequate. Any other ways to go about debt financing via government?
Yeah, debt financing has been much more challenging. Early in my career, I was at Department of Energy, and we actually had a loan program. It was sort of difficult because there's a sense that banks should do it. And the only reason why we actually had it at the time, this was in 2008 when the markets all froze up. And so Congress gave Department of Energy the authority, and we signed a number of deals. But the government has a more difficult time doing that. The kind of loans that we were doing, for example, we're trying to accept a little more risk to encourage innovation. But loans and risk don't necessarily go hand in hand, and frankly, the government's can be a challenging place when you have loan defaults and so on, so a lot of scrutiny. So, other than SBA, I'm not actually even familiar if anybody's even doing that. It sort of tends to get discouraged.
I mean, this is some of the framing we talked about for this panel, but it sounds like one of the appealing things that you were able to offer to many startups was the government contracts that were pretty straightforward to get at a small scale. And instead, I mean, I'll let you go into more detail, but that could be appealing even for seed stage funding versus trying to raise, I don't know, $300,000 from friends and family. What's your assessment of getting those sort of starter contracts?
Yeah, I think that for the government, from my experience, what I've seen is there's kind of a line between, is this just a research kind of thing, or is this something we can, or the government can buy and use, right? So if it's the latter, which are now getting to those larger numbers, you have to have probably some proof points. You probably already have demonstrated a product that has some capability. I think if you're trying to do earlier stage things, it's that what that other gentleman in your question had alluded to, an SBIR, which is a Small Business Innovation Research Grant, I think.
Yeah, even just, the government doesn't like if you're going to the government for the first dollar. Because there's a lot of people that says, just write me a check. Really what the government wants to see, particularly, is that you have a product that has commercial viability. And if it has some true commercial viability, they want to see that you have raised some initial funding. You have your own skin in the game, that you have some level of demonstrated capability in what you're going to produce. Then I think the government's more open to then coming in. And even then, at some of these early stages, the government will tend to prefer, not always, but a cost-sharing arrangement, where, let's say, the private entity puts in 30% and the government, will pick up the rest. Those are usually the best ways to get involved. If you come in sort of depending on the government, unfortunately, you can get kind of hooked on the government's sources of funding. And what will often happen with companies that sort of start that way, they build their product around the unique government needs, and so you're sort of captive to the government, which is
classic,
traditional.
Right, classic startup mistake of being a consulting business and not a product first.
So a lot of what I'm talking about when I was talking about commercial is really commercial products that do well in the commercial marketplace that can also be applied for the government need. That's the kind of stuff that the government is now having an increased interest in.
What's a good modern example? So everyone knows SpaceX, and they're probably why some of the people are here in the crowd. But what's a recent example that maybe people don't know about yet that you could talk about on that front?
Well, again, it's sort of early stage, but one of the big transformational changes that's happening in space is we're going from these, minivan, bus-size, huge satellites that have been built in the past, again, hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion to build it, to these really small, sometimes as small as you could hold in your hand, like a CubeSat, some are as big as a mini refrigerator. And so there's a lot of companies like OneWeb or Starlink or Kuiper is a new one that are trying to put these hugely proliferated constellations of small satellites. If these companies prove viable, they have sort of two advantages to the government. One is they actually might provide a service that the government likes, which is this global access, low latency capability. But the other is, for the first time, we're starting to see production numbers that start to get interesting in terms of the economics. So when you start to get into higher rates and stable supply base and so on, you're seeing the cost of some of these elements starts to become really interesting to the government. So DARPA has a project called Blackjack, which is to do exactly what I just talked about, is they're trying to take advantage of these kinds of companies and saying, all right, if you produce another 10, 20, 30 satellites for me, at low cost off your production line, I think I could do some really interesting things with that. As well as some of the stuff we talked about satellites, but even some stuff that's happening on the ground in terms of networking. And
So a question that has come up that you've seen headlines about, here in Northern California, a lot of people who work on technology have certain beliefs about how it should be used, and you guys, it's a question that comes up around here is how is the technology I build going to be used? Is it going to be used for defense? Is it going to be used for offense? Is it going to be used for civilian purposes? How do you address that when startups, especially around here, express hesitation for these feelings that they might not agree with how the technology they build is going to be used.
Well, I welcome the fact that folks are expressing their concerns, right? Because I think you need a high level of transparency to work through, which is a challenging and important, ethical problem. But I kind of go back to first principles, which is what is the purpose of having a strong national defense, right? For me, my opinion is it's to prevent and deter conflict. Which anybody that's been in a conflict, those are bad things, right? It'd be great to avoid them. And if you look at from 1945 to today, there's certainly been lots of conflicts, but in terms of a world, we've had the most relative sort of peace that we've had, and so that's important to maintain. So one is to step back and say, do we want to live in a world where liberal Western democratic ideals have supremacy, or more autocratic type of ideals, right? And should we be able to have the freedom of speech and press and vote to have the governments that we want? So I started that at the high level, right? And then I dropped down and say, well, what are you actually doing when you're building these pieces of technology? Who are you actually supporting? And oftentimes it's the individual soldier or sailor in the field, right? Who candidly does not have a decision. They signed up to serve, but they don't have a decision as to where they go. And your capability in technology will directly and very tangibly help save lives, help save their lives, help save the lives of innocent civilian bystanders. And again, I think we have to have a lot of transparency around how it's being used. But I'd go back and frame it around, who are you really working for, and what are you doing?
Yeah, I guess I'd answer it's sort of threefold to Bill and Raj's point. The world's ever more dangerous than frankly it's ever been. So if you think at 9/11, the day after, how horrified not only American citizens but people around the world as they look to that. What we're trying to do is prevent future 9/11s. And we were trying to tap into the people's sense of what's right in the world by the kinds of things we do in national security to prevent that. So to me, that's sort of point number one. Point number two is technology is becoming increasingly ubiquitous. So, to the extent you say, I'm not going to give it to you, it's happening anyways. And more than not, it's usually our adversaries that are getting it. In fact, the reason why the government is trying to move faster with the innovation I mentioned up front is because our adversaries are moving much faster than they ever have in terms of the innovation. So, you're not really sort of preventing it. And in fact, you just might be encouraging the other side from helping to get ahead. And then the final point, there's a lot of things that we do on the national security side which are for the benefit of what we do every day. I mean, GPS was created by the Air Force, all right? And it's operated by the Air Force, and we all benefit from GPS. A day without GPS would be a horrible day for the economy and a lot of what we're trying to achieve. Disaster relief, again, a lot of the capabilities that go in addressing that is coming from the kinds of things that we're developing. And even the protections that people that are starting their own companies, whether it's and cyber attacks and so on, a lot of that comes from the national security work that takes place. So there is sort of more that benevolent benefit that comes from the kinds of things that we're trying to do. So these are the three things I'd ask people to keep in mind.
What are you most excited about in terms of areas of technology that you're working on, that the government is working on and trying to foster?
Yeah. And I think there's this, Raj, you want to go first?
And I'm saying this as you guys are both startup people and you're government people, so you're wearing both hats.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a number of things that are exciting. Electric cars are not the only things that are going electric. Satellites are going all electric, and so they're much more efficient, longer lasting, much more capable. We're introducing artificial intelligence, so it's no longer just dumb satellites taking pictures, but now we're going to be building satellites that instead of just taking pictures of endless oceans, we'll be looking for boats or other things that are much greater interest. We have autonomy and robotics, where satellites that break in orbit will have other satellites that will actually help to repair them or refuel them or give them more capability as they go around. We had the additive manufacturing. There was a company yesterday that raised $140 million, relativity space, and it was all to 3D manufacture an entire rocket, a pretty audacious goal, but whether you're doing it on the ground, we're talking about additive manufacturing on the surface of the moon and Mars someday, so the astronauts will have the tool they need or the things they need to repair while they're up there. So there's a lot of technologies now that I think are really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think it's the stuff that folks here are working on already, and that's being probably discussed here at this conference, right? And a lot of these are technologies that just make humans much more efficient and accurate at their jobs, right? So this human-machine interface. So how can we use AI to distill a ton of different data and decision points to the ones where we need human interaction or not? How can we use robotics and autonomy to make individuals and other teams more effective? And I think we're at the stage now where it's not just proof of concept of these technologies, but actually operationalizing them and how people are changing the way they run their businesses. And I think we're going to see the same transformation as to how the government and the Department of Defense in particular is going to change how they do their mission. And so I think it's super exciting, and I don't think either side can do it alone, meaning the government can't do it without working closely with the brilliant technologists and entrepreneurs here. And for some of these technologies to really get to scale and make changes, again, changes for the positive, the government allows people to really take their innovations and distribute them far, far more broadly than they could on their own. So I think it's super exciting.
And so people who want to talk more, there's the DUI.mil site, I believe. DIU.
DIU, yeah.
And then there's the Aerospace Corp.
Yeah,
site.
I'd be happy to, again, we're sort of a good go-between between the governments. We're not professional Sherpas, but our job is actually to try to facilitate and help the government match make with a lot of the capability that's out there.
Great. Thank you so much. Please give them a big round of applause, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.